Good morning, everybody. How are you guys? Oh, that's a little better, but I heard, man, I don't know. Jason seemed like when he asked questions, we didn't respond well. So in just a second, we're going to play a game because that's what we would do in youth, and I lead our youth. So we're gonna get to a game in just a second. But before we can get there, I know you guys are all asking the same question. Does Pastor Greg even work here anymore? And the truth is, I think so. He is in Hawaii, so we'll see if he comes back. I'm just kidding. He's coming back next week. He's celebrating, last week Jason said he's celebrating 30 years of marriage, which is impressive. That's actually longer than I've been alive, so that makes it even more impressive to me. But hey, my name's Dominic. I get to lead our youth. I love it. I have a blast doing it, and sometimes I get to be in here with you guys, and I love that too. Today we're going to be talking about faith. And if you were to go to your Googles, your Safari, whatever you use as your web browser, Android people, I don't even know if you have a web browser. It's not quite as up to date as Apple people, but if you typed in faith, it would say this: complete trust or confidence in someone or something. That's what we're talking about today. But more so than just talking about faith and what is it, we're going to get to what comes out of our faith in Jesus. What should come out of that? Before we get there, though, we are going to play a little bit of a game. Don't worry, you don't have to get up, you don't have to run around, anything like that. I'm just going to ask a couple questions, and if it relates to you, just throw your hand up in the air. The first question is, who in here loves sports? Anybody? Okay, yep, there we go. I love sports too, so I'm right there with you. Who would say that they're like the next level of liking sports though? They're like die hard, like you have your sport, and if there's a game on that sport's being played, you're like, I'm watching it. I don't even care if it's not my favorite team. Anybody in here like that? Okay. Living in Michigan, if you want to watch sports, you kind of have to be a diehard fan, otherwise you're not really getting to see playoffs of any sport because of our teams. But hey, today we're talking, I bring up sports because I think that when we think of sports, we all have these greats that we think of. For me, I love basketball. I think of Michael Jordan, LeBron, controversial, I know. But I think of those two athletes as some of the greatest to play the game. And in the same way, there's a Hall of Fame for every single sport. Hall of Fame that some of you have maybe been to and looked around. And if you were to go in and look around, you would see the greatest of all times in there, whether it be the coaches, whether it be some of the players, whether it be they just had the most phenomenal game to ever happen. They have stat lines, and there's people in these places that are incredible athletes and incredible just people. And today we're talking about something a little bit similar. We're not talking about sports. We're talking about faith. And I bring up the athletes thing in the Hall of Fame because if you didn't know, there's actually a part in the Bible in Hebrews, it's Hebrews 11, that is referred to as the Hall of Faith. See what I did there? Hall of Fame, Hall of Faith. Yep, I thought that was impressive. It wasn't. Pretty easy connection to make. But here's what the Hall of Faith is. It's basically just a list of some of the greatest people in the Bible that showed and displayed faith. And they did it in exceptional ways. If you go to this passage in the Bible, in Hebrews 11, you're going to find that it says, it's like, and Noah had faith, and Abraham had faith. And it just literally keeps listing these people that had faith, these people that we should look up to. And they're put in this chapter of the Bible because they were incredible at displaying faith. So that's where we're going to kind of dive into today. And we're going to start with what Hebrews says in Hebrews 11, verse 6. It says, and without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. I read that passage because that's where we need to start. We know what faith is. We know that faith is having complete trust or confidence in someone. But we need to know, what do we do with that? And Hebrews 11 is great at just explaining and laying it out. Like, without faith, we can't please God. If we don't have faith, it doesn't matter how many good things you do or what kind of person you are, you will not please God. It's pretty just straight there. And I say it doesn't matter how many good things you do because that's true. I'm sure you've heard it said in churches like God's not checking off like numeral, like a list of what you've done, if it's good or if it's bad. He's not. He's not sitting out there just tallying everything you're doing. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to do good things and that action should not back our faith. In fact, James 2:14 through 17 says this: "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead." So we start in Hebrews by saying we need faith to please God. Then we see in James, but faith, it doesn't stop there. True, authentic faith means there's action that's going to come out of that. So it's not that you have to do a certain amount of good things to get into heaven or to please God. But all he's saying is if you actually have faith in me, you're going to trust my plan. You're going to trust what I am calling you to do, and there should be action that backs that faith. So it's not enough to walk in here and say, yep, I have faith, I believe in God, I attended church one time or two times or however many times. You actually have to put action to that faith. The Bible calls us to it. And today we're talking about what does that action look like? And if I had to give you a big idea or a title for the message, it would be that faith leads us to listen and obey. And out of that, listening and obeying, there's a few different things that happen. But when it comes to listening and obeying and having faith, one of the greatest to do it was Abraham. And we read the stories of Abraham in the Old Testament, and he's actually one of those guys that made it into the Hall of Faith. So I'm going to read for you what would be Abraham's, his stat line, some of his career's greatest moments, but it's of his faith. Hebrews 11, 8 through 12 says this: "By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. Even though he did not know where he was going, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore." So that's some of Abraham's great moments of faith. It says God called him out of a land, and he went and he trusted. They lived in tents, and then God said, "Hey, I'm going to give this land to you, but more so your descendants." And he's like, "Well, I don't have kids." And it says he was past childbearing years, but he still went, and he still understood that God's calling me to it, so I'm going to go. I'm going to have faith, and I'm going to back my faith with action. So he goes. And we see that throughout his story, which we're going to dive into even deeper. We're going to hit on some of the big moments today. We see that Abraham, he lived by faith, and that's what got him in this book. He made some mistakes along the way, but he lived by faith to the point where he's actually considered by a lot of people the father of our faith today. He stepped out. He was bold. When God called him to something, he did it. And that's what we're going to get to today. If faith really is authentic and true, and we believe what we read, and we believe the songs we sing and the messages we hear, there should be action that comes with it. Faith leads us to listen and obey. But here's the deal. When we listen and obey, there's some things that actually happen along that process. The first thing is, it usually takes getting uncomfortable. Genesis 12, 1 through 7 says that the Lord said to Abram, we're going to stop right there for just a second. In this passage, it's going to refer to Abraham as Abram. Don't be confused, it's the same guy. But later on in the story of Abram, God says, I'm changing your name, and changes it to Abraham. So we're reading about the same person today, but it starts out in the first few passages, it's going to be Abram and Sarai, and then it's going to move to Abraham and Sarah. So just to clear that up so you're not like, what the heck is Dom talking about? I promise it makes sense. Genesis 12, 1 through 7. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all people on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. If you're taking notes, write that down. It's going to be important later on. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At the time the Canaanites were in the land, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give you this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now the reason I say when we listen and obey, it takes getting uncomfortable is because as we read that story of Abram, he had to get uncomfortable. God called him at 75 years old to get up, to leave everything he was used to, and step out in faith and go to the land that he was going to promise and was going to give to Abram. And as we continue, it got even more uncomfortable because we see that God was going to give it to his descendants. And at that time, Abram didn't have kids. It wasn't like he just had a ton of kids running around where he's like, yep, this kind of makes sense. He was stepping out in another way too because he was trusting that I'm past childbearing years, but God, if he's calling me to it, he's going to see me through it. So he stepped out. But it takes getting uncomfortable. And it's the same for you and for me. I don't know what God's calling you to, but what I do know is a lot of times it takes getting uncomfortable. I relate to this passage because, as many of you know, Callie, my wife, and I, we moved to Arizona. And I was not the person that ever thought I would leave my family. I thought maybe I would leave Howell, Michigan and not live in my parents' basement all the time. That still hasn't fully worked out. But God called us to Arizona. So we stepped out and we said, all right, he's calling us to it. We went. Callie didn't have a job. There was lots of pieces that we were just trusting if God's calling us to it, he's going to see us through it. For me, I relate to this moving to a different land. But for many of us, God isn't calling us to just get up and to move to a different country or to a different state. For many of us, it's something that's a lot more simple. It's something like God's calling you to serve. You've been attending and God's saying, hey, serve. I need you to start serving. I have a plan for you. You got to start serving. Or for some of you, it's you need to change jobs, and God's been calling you to it. You know he's been calling you to it, but there's a pay cut, or it's a little uncomfortable because you've been at that job forever. Whatever it is, if God's calling you to it, we need to step out. We need to get uncomfortable. A few weeks ago, I shared with you guys some of the wins that we had at camp, and one of the wins that I loved was we got these cards on the last night. And the pastor there, he said, hey, I'm giving you these kingdom worker cards. Take them, but do not open them if you're not ready to commit to what's on the inside. In these kingdom worker cards, there were challenges to all the youth and even to the leaders that wanted to take them. They were challenges that you had no clue what you were getting yourself into. So that what they were told to do was to spend time praying and really seeking God and seeing, is this something God's calling me to? And if it is, open that card and they said, like, actually do what's on the inside of that card. Well, we had a few that opened it, and one of the stories that stands out to me is one of our youth, his name's Caleb. He began to do what's on the inside of that card. He got back, and that week, he began to serve in children's ministry because that's what his card was telling him to do. And this week, as I was writing the message and coming up with what do I say and how do I make this relatable, I was like, man, I got to share Caleb's story because he stepped out. He did something that was uncomfortable, something he wasn't used to. So I called him just to make sure he was cool with me sharing it. And as I was on the phone, I said, Caleb, did it make you uncomfortable to step out? Kind of trying to like guide the conversation so it could fit into the sermon. And he goes, Dom, honestly, it didn't matter that I was uncomfortable or anything else. All that mattered was God was calling me to it. So I was going to do it. And I love that. That shows a maturity. That shows faith that's backed with listening and obeying. And Caleb, to this day, he showed up this morning to listen to the message so that he could go serve in children's ministry today as well. And he's continuing to do it because God called him to something. And I share that because I think for a lot of us, that's a lot more relatable than maybe getting up and just moving across the country. Sometimes it's just God wants us to change a little thing in our life that actually feels really big because it's something we're not used to, something that's not the normalcies of our day-to-day life. So when we listen and obey out of our faith, that leads us to, more times than not, get uncomfortable. The second thing it leads us to is being patient. Because when we listen and obey, we're going to see that a lot of times it still doesn't happen on our timing. Just because we step out and say, all right, God, I'm with you, more times than not, there's still a lot of waiting and a lot of not knowing, and we have to be patient. The story of Abraham continues in Genesis 21, 1 through 5, and it says, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son that Sarah bore. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now, if you were taking notes, I told you to write down that he was called at 75 years old to get up, to leave his land, and to go somewhere that he was unfamiliar with, and that he would be promised that land through his descendants. If you do the math, that means from 75 to 100 years old, Abraham still would have been like, what the heck is happening? I don't understand. But God still showed up. But sometimes it takes waiting. Just because we step out, it doesn't mean that God is just going to give us everything that we've always desired, everything he's always promised us at once. More times than not, it takes being patient and waiting and continuing to trust in God's plan. And we actually see in the story of Abraham that there was moments where he wasn't patient. Because a chapter before this, he was going and they still didn't have descendants. And Sarai, his wife, came to him and said, Abram, I have an idea. And he said, all right, let's hear it. And in this idea, she's like, hey, I have a servant girl. And clearly we still don't have children. But God promised you this. So she's like, I think if you sleep with her, we'll get a kid because she's younger. And then we can fulfill God's promise. And obviously, Abram is like, you're telling me to fulfill God's promise. I have to go sleep with someone? He's like, all right, I guess I'm in. Which, guys in the room, that's probably a dumb decision if your wife tells you to do that. Even if she says to fulfill God's promise. But here's the deal. They did that. And they took matters into their own hands. They said, God, we're going to do this because it just makes sense. It just feels like maybe this is what you're calling us to. Maybe we haven't put enough action forth, so we're going to just start doing it on our own. But what we see in that story is that heartbreak and heartache comes out of that. They tried to speed up a process and a plan that God had that was still to come 15 years later at that point, because that was 10 years into this promise. and it didn't end well. It got messy. And God still used those mistakes, and he still used that. And that's a whole different story and sermon, but God did use that for his good and to bring glory to his name. But what we see is they got impatient. And it led to unnecessary heartache, unnecessary conflict within their marriage and even within like just the household and having that servant. She went on the run and it got messy. And I tell you that because I think a lot of times God can call us to something and we can be excited. We can be like, yep, I'm nervous, but I'm stepping out in faith. And then we can be like, all right, it's been a week and I still don't know why God called me to that. Or it's been months and I'm still unsure why God called me to it. I know he did, but I'm unsure why he did. Or in some instances, it's been years. For Abram, it was 25 years of just not knowing and having to trust God and say, okay, I don't have descendants, but I'm trusting that you are going to fulfill a promise that you made to me, fulfill this covenant that we have. And God did. God showed up. But it was on his timing. So the second thing that happens is when faith leads us to listen and obey, within that, we still have to be patient. We have to not take it into our own hands, and we got to still say, God, I trust you. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to wait for what you've promised. The third thing that needs to happen is we need to trust in God's plan. Genesis 22, 1 through 13 says this. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, he loaded his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and his son, Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and he placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father, yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. We're going to pause right there for a second. So we see that now Abraham has a son. He's being told, I need you to go sacrifice your son to me. So it's all starting to make sense. God has this plan. Abraham's like, yep, I can kind of see it. Like, he gave us a son, well past childbearing years. He's like, I can see it coming together. But then we get to this point where he's now told to sacrifice that son. And what does Abraham do? He says, all right, God's calling me to do it. I'm going to trust the process. I'm going to trust his plan. And I'm going to go up to that mountain. I'm going to sacrifice my son. But this is long enough into his son being born that his son's like the one carrying most of the load and also the one that's like, wait, Dad, what are we doing? We forgot the most important piece. We forgot the sacrifice. So this is years and years of waiting. He gets this, what seems like it's going to be the promise, and then he's told to sacrifice his son years into having him. But Abraham says, you know what? God's been faithful. I've seen him show up. I'm going to step out, and once again, I'm going to go, and I'm going to sacrifice my son. And he says, the Lord will provide. It continues on in verse 9, and it says, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld me, your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and he took the ram and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Abraham got what seemed like a fulfillment of a promise. He got Isaac. It was a miracle in itself that he even got Isaac, that they were even able to have children. But he didn't hold on to Isaac with closed hands and say, "Nope, God, you gave it, I'm not giving him back." He held on with open hands and he said, "God, if you really want me to sacrifice him, I will." So years into this story, Abraham is still being faithful. And what we also see is God's plan's not even close to over at this point in the story. Abraham easily could have run from God again. He had already made mistakes previously, but he learned and he said, "Nope, God will be faithful. I believe that. I have faith in him. He's calling me to something. I'm going to obey it." And sure enough, God shows up in a way that is incredible and provides a sacrifice that isn't his son, but God needed to see that he trusted him. I think for a lot of us, we're going to do the first couple steps. We're going to step out and be uncomfortable. We're going to do that. It might take some like pumping up and having someone like speak life into us to actually step out and do that, but we will do that. For some of us, we might even be patient once we step into that. But we have to remember, even years down the road, once we're starting to see, okay, this is what God has called me to, it's starting to make sense, that even when life changes or something happens that we're like, well, it doesn't make sense again. Well, remember where you started and remember what God's done and choose to still trust in his promises and trust in his plan. It's not a one-time thing. It's not like we get to just step out in confidence once and then the story is over. We have to continually do it. We have to continually lean into God and say, "God, what are you asking me to do?" And then we have to obey that. And sometimes the truth is we're not even going to see what God was doing while we're here on earth, because sometimes it's way bigger than us, because God's way bigger than us. We won't be here forever, but a little act of confidence and trusting in God might go years down the road and impact someone that you will never know, that you'll never meet, but they'll have heard your story and somehow it will have impacted them. It's not enough just to have faith and say, "Yep, I got it." Action has to come with that. You have to lean into what God is saying. Out of faith comes listening and obeying. And that's when we truly are living the life that God has called us to. It's when we're saying, "Okay, I believe in you, but now I'm going to actually follow you. I'm going to actually put action to it." I believe God's calling us all in this room to something. For you, I don't know what it is. For me, honestly, I might not even know what it is. But my encouragement and my challenge to you is this week, this month, just as you go through life, is to lean into what God is saying. And if he calls you to it, understand that he will see you through it. We don't worship and praise a God that just calls us to stuff and then leaves us hanging. That's not how he does it. He sees us through it. And his plan is so much bigger than anything that you or I could ever think or imagine. But we know from the Bible that he has a plan to prosper us, a plan to bring glory to his name through us. But we have to be willing to step out. We have to step out in confidence. We have to be patient once we step out, and we have to continually just trust in his plan. Authentic faith leads us to listen and obey. Let me pray for you guys, and then we'll get out of here. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you that you are a God that keeps his promises and fulfills them. I thank you that you are a God that calls us to get out of our comfort zone, because life is better when we're following you. I pray that as we all leave here today, God, that you would just lay on our hearts what you are calling us to, and that you would give us the confidence and the boldness to step out and say, I'm trusting you, and I'm putting action to my faith. I pray that we wouldn't just be a people that come to church on Sunday mornings and say we have faith, but then don't actually live it out. I pray that we would be a people that live it out because we truly trust you. I pray that as we leave here today, that your hand would be over each and every one of us. We pray this all in your precious and holy name. Amen.